Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is David Godwin and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange program with the University of Florida. Today I'm excited about our presentation from Dr. Morgan Varner, Director of Fire Research for Tall Timbers Research Station. Dr. Varner will be talking about the need for a new and advanced line of work today that will support the expansion and advancement of prescribed fire. And finally, it's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Morgan Varner is the Director of Fire Research at Tall Timbers Research Station and Land Conservancy in Tallahassee, Florida. Dr. Varner coordinates Tall Timbers' local to international collaborations aimed at improving the understanding of fire behavior and predictions of fire effects on plants and animals. Prior to joining Tall Timbers, Morgan was the team leader and a research scientist at the Pacific Wildland Fire Science Lab with the USDA Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station in Seattle, Washington. He has also been on the faculty of Mississippi State University, Virginia Tech, and Humboldt State University. And from 2014 to 2016, Morgan was the chair of the Coalition of Prescribed Fire Councils. Morgan has a PhD in interdisciplinary ecology from the University of Florida School of Natural Resources and Environment, an MS in forestry from Auburn University, and a BS in forest resources from the University of Idaho. Welcome, Morgan. Glad to have you with us today.
Well, thanks for the introduction, and thanks everybody today for joining us. I know we're all tired of sitting in our offices or homes and looking at screens, so I really appreciate folks coming. I think in some ways, the overwhelming attendance today is a testament to how important this topic is, and hopefully this is of value to you. And my goal today is really to stimulate thought. This is not a traditional science talk where I'm going to give you the methods, results, and then and show a lot of graphs. I'm going to talk about stuff that hopefully provokes discussion beyond this and inspires a lot of people to, whether you're a manager or scientist or somewhere between, to be engaged in something like this movement that we're calling prescribed fire science. I'm presenting today on behalf of many, and I'll try to drop their names. And I think a lot of these names will be familiar to people working in prescribed fire, not just in the South, but across the country and the world. This is a real collective effort, and it's always difficult to give a talk when many people have been engaged and many people are responsible for it. So I'll take the blame for any errors, and please send your accolades to them. This idea of prescribed fire science is really the result of many years of folks scratching their heads and wondering why fire science broadly overlooks prescribed fire. I was part of a strategic planning workshop at Tall Timbers in 2015. And in that, if you've been through strategic planning sorts of engagements, they can be sort of meh. And this one was pretty dynamic in that it was understanding of what had happened in the past, but also looking forward and trying to be, just as the name implies, strategic. Tall Timbers, as many of you know, is the birthplace of fire ecology and in some ways the birthplace of modern prescribed fire. And so it makes sense looking to the future for Tall Timbers to be engaged in something that we all called prescribed fire science. So that list of people were all there, pasting things on boards, and this RX fire science continued to come up. That's really an outcome of a lot of major integrated research projects on prescribed fire, like RX Cadre, and really this started to get legs under something that Tall Timbers, Forest Service Research and Development, and a host of other partners were involved in this consortium that we call the Prescribed Fire Science Consortium. And we've had events that probably many of you have been involved in or have heard about here in Tallahassee, in Missoula, in central Utah, and one planned this year for the New Jersey Pine Barrens. And really it is, and I think in a lot of ways, an unprecedented effort where from the Forest Service side, all branches of research and development engaged in a single topic, working across sort of the traditional walls that we put up around ourselves, and I think multiple universities and multiple other agencies and NGOs. And one sort of deliverable, and in a way it is charting a path forward, was the paper that that David mentioned, and he gave you a link to it. Here's another link to it here. This is an open access paper, and so everyone has access to it without a paywall. And it was really charting this research agenda and introducing the topic of, not trying to be too bold, but a new branch of fire science that we termed prescribed fire science. You can look at the logos and see the diversity of partners, managers, scientists working from a variety of different agencies and universities. I think that's a testament to the strength of the idea. To be vetted internally is one thing, and then for us to release it to the rest of the interested parties is another. So I'll be talking about this. I'd encourage you to take a look at it. Again, just like this, I'm hoping that it's, we all hope that it's provoking and that it gets you excited about this topic. So a little bit to set the stage and talk about the rationale for this. If you need to be convinced of the importance of prescribed fire, I think a lot of us who work on prescribed fire often have a chip on our shoulders when it comes to science, that we really don't get the billing that's fair. Many people say it's an East versus West bias for discussing fire, but really prescribed fire is either as common or covers more area than wildfire does annually. That's relatively consistent. And so there's, at a real base level, there should be an equality in our discussions about prescribed fire. And if you think about it, prescribed fires are planned events. They have detailed descriptions of the objectives. There is a detailed understanding of all the social, fire weather, fire behavior aspects. So there's a tremendous amount of forethought that is in relative stark contrast to how we think about wildfires. So just from a wildfire or from a wildland fire standpoint, prescribed fires are important, and we all know it. From the wildland fire science aspect, there's also what you should expect, I guess, in some ways, is an equality. If they both cover about the same amount of area, or prescribed fires or more, perhaps there would be a similar amount of research on the two topics. But if you look at funding, for instance, the Joint Fire Science Program in the United States, the primary funder of fire research over the last 20 years, there's about a 3-to-1 wildfire to prescribed fire topic funding. So a real disparity in spite of the heavy use of prescribed fire. In our in the science journals, the two dominant ones, the International Journal of Wildland Fire and Fire Ecology, we looked at, for the International Journal, we looked at over 14 years of published articles, and it's, again, about a 3-to-1 ratio of topics related to wildfire or focused on wildfire versus those focused on prescribed fire. So really an overwhelming, from at least the international audience, on wildfire topics. And in fire ecology, I'm a fire ecologist. In our field, I think as most of you know, we need to be able to control variables and understand variables so that we can report them, so that our research is repeatable and that folks can pick apart why something may have happened. And so in fire ecology, you would expect at least equality, but perhaps that prescribed fire would be much more of a topic than wildfire. But even in fire ecology, more than 50% more articles are on the topic of wildfire. So I think you see that in spite of the dominance of prescribed fire, the importance to all of your agencies, to private landowners, et cetera, it's been somewhat neglected in the scientific literature and by science funders. And that'd be okay if the two, if science generated based on wildfires was broadly applicable to prescribed fires. But I think most of us know that that's not the case, and they really differ in their focus. And what I'm going to do is, just as our paper does, go through the individual aspects from a research standpoint, but it also, each of these has a really strong management overlap. So I'll talk about the differences in fire behavior, fuels, fire weather effects, some of the social, political, legal environment, and operational challenges that that are just, unfortunately or fortunately, they're different for prescribed fire, which I think really calls for us to change the way we look at it, and really strengthens this call for prescribed fire science. So let's talk about fire behavior first. And in some ways, maybe it's the most obvious of the examples. These images are, this is Northern California burnt prescribed fire, and I think you could have your own images of your own area. We know that fires are ignited in different ways than wildfires are, from it, whether it's a strip ignition at the top or some modified, local ignition technique to meet a certain ecological objective or a hazard reduction objective, et cetera. Fundamentally, the ignitions are intentional in prescribed fire, and that really changes the way fires behave. In almost all prescribed fires, there's tremendous fire line interaction, whether it's that top image of those strips. They're interacting with each other. They're being affected by the draw that the strip adjacent to it and the one behind it are. A lot of the sort of, in wildfire, we talk about junction fires where fires come together. That happens in every prescribed fire. It's always a massive feature, an overwhelming feature of those. And so it gets a lot of prominence in prescribed fire. Backing fire is really important in prescribed fires. All prescribed fires have a backing fire somewhere. They're used more in some ignition patterns than others. But the general focus of wildfire is on spread rate and on forward spread rate. And so it really opens up a lot of different, from a scientific standpoint, it opens up a lot of different potential questions related to backing fire. The variation, because of the majority of prescribed fires are within a day, they're within smaller periods of a day. The diurnal, or really the diel within the daytime variation, becomes really, really important. So a real shift in scale from looking at a wildfire over multiple days, multiple weeks or months, to what happens in an individual unit. That becomes the real focus of prescribed fire behavior. I already mentioned that spread rate is not nearly as important in prescribed fire. Having been a professor for 12 years and trying to have my own students project or predict spread rates and then apply those spread rates to prescribed fire, it invariably causes someone to raise their hand and say, but you just lit a fire ahead of it. And so does this really matter? And I think that incongruity between the tools we develop to predict and to understand whether we're predicting or we're reconstructing using the wildfire behavior tools, it really falls apart when looking at prescribed fire, and their utility is certainly challenged. And I think this other concept that Kevin Hires and Rod Lynn have thought about and have been working on is this concept of marginal fire. Prescribed fires tend to be ignited under a relatively short period since a wetting event, or at least on that margin, on a cool margin. And so we should have a corresponding focus of research on that cool margin that is really not part of general fire science and fire science focused on wildfires. And I think from a science standpoint, there's some pretty straightforward topics. And what I really like about this general topic of prescribed fire science is the overlap and the interest between managers and scientists. These are fire tech runs, a model run by Rod Lynn from Los Alamos National Labs, and work that he and Kevin Hires and James Furman and others worked on at Eglin Air Force Base and have been moving forward. And to be able to model ignition, so that image on the left, you can see the strips that are moving from the bottom of the screen, or from the bottom of the screen to the top, and you can see the trees from that top view in A, and B, you can see the vertical wind speed and the high diversity. These things are important from a prescribed fire standpoint from a number of reasons. But imagine if you can see in the left the road on the right of that burn unit, and then notice the vertical winds in that right B image. This has implications for spotting. It has implications for escapes, things that matter from a prescribed fire standpoint, not just on that burn unit, but matter for that season and for many years after. So understanding that better is certainly a focus. I think the other part of this that's interesting is this emphasis and this really a shortcoming in the way we model and predict fire behavior from a firefighter safety standpoint. If these images on the left are surprising to you, that's troubling because this affects how fires spread. We've all been on fires and watched as the prevailing wind direction is in one direction and the fire is moving in an altogether very different, whether during gusts or other flows that are interrupted by roads or by vegetation. And I think those sorts of surprises in a lot of ways are unacceptable and really cause us to rethink what are the needs from a firefighter standpoint, from a safety standpoint, beyond just the operational. So I think this opens up a lot of really cool avenues for scientists and managers to work together and for scientists to understand the complexity depicted in those left images. From a fuel standpoint, clearly prescribed fires and wildfires are burning the same fuels. We've had in the US a relatively coarse-grained approach to understanding fuels, whether it was in the old fuel models or in revised fuel models over the last decade and a half. We tend to look at them in a one-dimensional or perhaps a two-dimensional standpoint. We describe fuel beds based on their loading or height, really simplistic measures that don't get at the inherent variability in fuels that relate to the inherent variability in fire behavior. Fuels are important from a wildfire standpoint from a lot of different reasons, but emissions are really important from a predictive standpoint in prescribed fire. We're asking society to grant us license and understanding emissions better and from their source as fuel becomes critically important. We're also, prescribed fire begs for more understanding of moisture dynamics. Moisture clearly dampens fire behavior and understanding what drives it, whether the importance of a sunfleck or individual species differences. Those become critically important. And from a wildfire perspective, it's a very different realm of questioning. Because prescribed fire focuses, or at least currently is focused in the southeastern US, where something like 70% of annual acreage is burned, it calls for a regional prioritization that for as much fire as happening in the southeast, for example, we ought to be tripling or quadrupling our efforts to understand the fuels of the southeast. And where we're talking about expanding prescribed fire in the same light, we should focus investments in those. So not just a general understanding of fuels, but a really focused plan. And I think what is clear from those who've applied a lot of prescribed fire is that fine scale variation matters. It matters quite a bit in how fires spread, how ignition patterns should change during fires. So understanding the spatial scale and also the temporal scale as ignitions change during a day or as cloud cover increases, et cetera. And these get to these new concepts that many of the co-authors have been focusing on: three-dimensional fuels, where we take not only the X and the Y, but starting to look at variation in height, and also the four-dimensional fuels, where we bring in time so that we understand, and from a prescribed fire standpoint, just how rapidly fuel moisture can change and what those implications would be for prescribed fire. Kevin and I were burning, this is yesterday, and discussing it. And I don't think the discussion was because I was going to be talking to you today, but this is the discussions that all of you have. A picture like this is on Tall Timbers. This is an annually burned unit, and you could now start in your head talking about what the relative humidity was, what the mixing height was. You can see on in the back right, there's a wall of vegetation that's affecting the flows across this unit. And I think these sorts of discussions, the way they usually end up is We don't really know. That's a good question. I think this, and it's a bit of a betting environment rather than having certainty. And I think these sorts of misunderstandings, or at least a clouded view of how fuels are related to fire behavior and how they interact, is a real area for growth and for investment in prescribed fire science. Fire weather is clearly another major area of difference between wildfire science, if you will, and prescribed fire science. The same fine scale issues that are important from a fire behavior or a fuel standpoint reign in prescribed fire meteorology. Small obstructions have massive consequences, and understanding really fine scale variation in winds, in atmospheric connections matter in prescribed fire. Obviously, we're igniting these fires, and so it makes it relatively different. The same concept of marginal and extreme fires, and like that bottom conceptual model and how we discussed earlier, prescribed fires tend to take place relatively close after passage of fronts that include lots of precipitation. And so in general, managers have a tremendous and deep understanding of meteorology. I think, the training in higher education and in our NWCG training for our understanding of weather phenomena, we've always known that there's so much more that we could get beyond our 1 day or 1 week class. And seasoned managers have this tremendous understanding. And I think whenever that's the case, something built on experience rather than something we're able to teach, then it shows a real gap in our ability to predict. I think that's at lots of different scales, whether it's at the individual burn unit scale, or we think about scales across large areas. Here's that area where 70% of prescribed fire has taken place. And to be able to look at variation in conditions that allow prescribed fire to take place, how much variation there is within burn seasons, and how much variation there is among years, starts to become a primary issue that deserves a lot of attention. I'm a fire ecologist, so my primary interest in this topic has always been in fire effects. And I think it's evident to all of us that prescribed fires are ignited for a purpose, and they're based on objectives, and primarily there are certainly fire hazard reduction objectives, but there tend to be ecological objectives that drive a tremendous amount of prescribed fire application. And if that's the case, we'd like to increase precision, certainly, but also our predictability. And the tools that we have to predict fire effects have been, just like most other aspects of fire science, have been based on wildfires. That image in the top right is a fire severity map in the southern portion of the Biscuit Fire in Southwest Oregon. And that sort of really coarse scale pixels that put, burn, in this case, burn severity into a category in a large pixel has always been inadequate for prescribed fire. Our tree mortality models have their origins in wildfires. And usually what we want to know is something about a size class or individual trees. And those tools were never designed for that sort of individual tree prediction. And so we shouldn't be surprised that they don't ever work for it, or that they work poorly. The same sort of, in addition to that, the same marginal versus extreme fires matters. When prescribed fires are ignited at that margin, trying to anticipate fire effects from relatively low intensity fires is very different than the conditions that we might have built our models on, the extreme fires that are characteristic of a lot of wildfires. In prescribed fires, we often prescribe and have as an objective patchiness. It's something we talk about all the time. There's really not a burn that I've ever been a part of where someone doesn't say, what do you want to do with those patches over there that didn't burn? Or, yeah, it didn't carry very well in area X or area Y. This map to the right is the Wade Tract in South Georgia. This is mapped work that Kevin Robertson and others have focused on, showing unburned patches. And these unburned patches are not just trivial or a mathematical relationship. They are sites where trees can establish important trees in this system, where plant diversity patterns will be different. They're strong contrast in animal habitat, and they also had feedbacks to subsequent burns. And so I think, that's a nice example of how, patchiness and really these smaller scales matter. And I think all the variation that you all know about in prescribed fire, it makes it very difficult. We all classically say, you can't say the site was burned and then predict something about it. You need to know something more about ignition patterns. You need to know something more about when it occurred, what the preceding conditions and what the conditions were after it. And that long list of things that we all say it depends, or something about location matters. And I think those are all elements of prescribed fire that in some ways we've thrown our hands up. But from a scientific standpoint, we ought to be bold enough to be able to invest and understand what drives these patterns. Looking at it from a post standpoint, like we typically do with wildfires, it's hard to know that a wildfire is going to occur, and so we can make a lot of measurements before the wildfire spreads over our site. But prescribed fire, we have just that control where we can intervene, understand what was there, understand what happened during the fire, and then understand what transpires following the fire. And those are rare opportunities and a really exciting way to move prescribed fire science forward. I think we all have examples of where that matters. This is a thermal IR image from northern Florida following the passage of a flaming front. So long after the fire, the flaming front had subsided, you can see these trees that are peppered through this image, those three moving from left to right, where the surface temperatures are still really warm. And this is looking at smoldering fire surrounding old longleaf pines. This is clearly a spot where we need to understand what's happening at a really small scale that in a wildfire would be lost. But our ability to intervene and understand what the conditions were prior to the fire and during the fire that caused these is a real, I think, a characteristic aspect of prescribed fire science. I think in a lot of other ways, prescribed fire in that asking permission standpoint, which is basically how prescribed fire and prescribed burners communicate with society. We've asked permission to burn. We've asked society to approve it through regulatory bodies, et cetera. Whereas wildfires tend to be acts of God, and all the rules tend to be relaxed for them. So there's a tremendous amount of work. That there's been some work done already on favorability, but the complexity of different landscapes. Here in Tallahassee, where I'm standing today, we're surrounded on the south side of Tallahassee by large Apalachicola National Forest, one of the most burned national forests in the country. As you rotate east, a real patchwork of federal and state lands, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and as you come back around on the north side, a massive landscape of private lands burners. They're burning in that area surrounding Tallahassee, 200 or 300,000 acres, a tremendous amount of fire happening, and us trying to put what society thinks or their interactions with fire into a really simple box is pretty naive. I think there are a lot of regional and cultural differences that we all cite, having worked in California and having worked in the South. Clearly have different views of fire, and not uniquely, but it's interesting from a political standpoint that state laws dominate in prescribed fire. Wildfire is certainly governed by individual states, but federal laws and federal organizations are often tightly involved in large incidents. And I think that interaction, the dichotomy is not just on paper. That's 50 different states with 50 different approaches to what we do every day. And I think that has a lot of space to have 50 different models, to pick a model that works best and to understand the sort of transferability of those. We also know, and it's just starting to be recognized, that prescribed fire practitioners are a real community of practice. This is that image at the top is a prescribed fire council meeting. I happen to know a lot of those folks. They're from state agencies, federal agencies, they're individual private lands burners, they're scientists from universities, they're regulators from EPA. It's just a real diverse audience, but they're all coming together to work on a single issue of prescribed fire. And I think there's a lot of potential work to be done to understand how those communities of practice can work better together, where they work better together, and how those might be models for not only in the United States, but might be exportable models. And the last of these differences, and maybe the most obvious, maybe it should have been first, is just how drastically different the operation side of prescribed fire and wildfire are, and what those science implications are. Prescribed fire is largely, in the United States, is largely that guy at the top with a drip torch. Certainly it involves ATVs, it involves aerial ignition, but the scale of prescribed fires always pale in comparison to, for example, that fire camp at the bottom, that we have these small cities that are organized and disorganized based on wildfire events. The cost and the cost considerations are radically different. The operational impediments to making this work happen. And like I mentioned earlier, for each of those aspects, fire behavior, fire weather, fire effects, each of them have decision support tools that managers rely on to make decisions, or better, to support their decisions as they're designed. You're not putting values into a computer and hoping it gives you the answer. You're saying, this is what based on my experience, this is how I think this should go, and it'll meet these objectives, and let's look at the support for this. And I think understanding that the guy at the top is operating without a great suite or a great toolbox of decision support tools should be upsetting to all of us. Okay. I think, in the paper, there's a table where we start to, in the title is a research agenda. And I think you can hear from and see from my presentation some of these areas that are clear topics. You can see that interaction of fire lines. I think that's a graphic topic that offers a lot. And these others, kind of fit what your poll said. Clearly smoke is important. Clearly fire effects are important. A good 30% of you thought that was primary. The linking fuels and fire behavior are clearly important. And obviously, a large number of you were focused on the social aspect and overcoming impediments that can be both operational and impediments that can be social, and sometimes both. We have a group that is focused on it. I mentioned the Prescribed Fire Science Consortium. I'll mention it again when I close. But I think these topics are well beyond the capacity of our group to focus on, and we have always sought out collaboration on these topics. So in some ways, I would say, as I get ready to close, some folks have taken this, as you might imagine. We've presented this almost 3 years, 2.5 years ago, I guess, at a conference, and in the audience, it was a mixture of managers and scientists. And the scientists, as you'd expect, had their arms folded on their chest and had a very skeptical, contemplative look on their face. Like, what are they saying? And I think some of them took it in our discussions later as, why are you pitting prescribed fire against wildfire? The managers were all nodding their heads, and in some ways the expression was, it's about time. And I think that gets to, there's some clear needs. There are wants in some of our research, and there are also some needs. And I think rather than thinking about wildfire being versus prescribed fire science, I think there are a lot of things, a lot of areas within these topics that, if we learn about them and focus them in prescribed fire, wildfire science will reap the benefits as well. Understanding interacting fire lines and somewhere that you can control it from a prescribed fire standpoint will help us understand interacting fire lines in wildfire suppression. And I also think there's, obviously in many large managed wildfires, whatever the name is today, wildland fire use fires, fires managed for resource benefit, but where large wildfires are being managed for resource benefit, that area in the middle, there's a clear area for prescribed fire science to step in and inform how those fires are managed, but also to gain a better understanding of fire behavior more generally. Beyond that, it seems the topic du jour in fire science is this topic of co-production, where managers and scientists work together. And many of us have argued for a while that this is how we've always done it. But prescribed fire science makes us think that because it has been a collaboration, and I think we can formalize that more and really invest in it. I really do believe that prescribed fire science is made for this co-production. So many of you, tuned in today because you're really concerned about it. And I think, that want versus need aspect really shows itself with prescribed fire science. Many managers want there to be an interesting paper on a topic in my area of fire effects, for instance, but what they need is a better decision support tool to understand tree mortality, for instance. And I think this is a great opportunity for managers and scientists to work together to get mutual benefit and have actionable science. So I think to close up, clearly we all know that there's a tremendous interest in both maintaining and increasing prescribed fire. And to do that, there's a clear need for decision support to enable that. And I think there are a lot of different ways that I just described and that you've all talked to me about in the past for ways we might move forward with that. Later this, I guess, David mentioned that there's a quick fire modeling webinar that's planned soon. You can look back and see where that is, but that's an example of this sort of taking this problem and looking for real solutions. Rod Lynn, Scott Goodrick from the Southern Research Station in Athens, and Kevin Hires from Tall Timbers are going to be talking about that. And I hope you also see from this, without me even saying it, there's a tremendous opportunity for manager-scientist collaboration in this effort. The Prescribed Fire Science Consortium has always been managers and scientists working together. And I think that's the way we move forward in this. And from a scientific perspective, we just listed, and the paper lists even more of these obvious areas for investigation. And I hope that that's exciting as everyone's in their house thinking of their next science project. And I'll close there. I mentioned that, there are 19 co-authors on the paper. I think any of us in the past, this was a Forest Service Tall Timbers and many agency, many university collaborative, but I think any of us, and I just listed a few of us here, would be happy to talk about it beyond this and happy to engage with you on this topic. Thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to any questions and discussion.
Alrighty, well, thanks, Morgan. Enjoyed that presentation. Once again, if you joined our webinar during Morgan's talk, my name is David Godwin, and I'm the Director of the Southern Fire Exchange. And that was a presentation from Dr. Morgan Varner, Director of Fire Research at Tall Timbers Research Station. So at this point in our program, we have the opportunity for you to ask questions. You can type your questions into the Q&A window in Zoom, and we'll try and get through those in the time we have remaining. So Morgan, I'm going to pull the questions up here. All right, here's a question that came in from Nick. And Nick says, do you see prescribed fire as a tool that can be used on smaller scale, something in the 1 to 5 acres, Nick says, something akin, he says, to like a landscaping service. So small scale burns, patch burns, maybe even micro burns. Morgan, what do you say about that?
Yeah, historically, many areas of the world used them in that way, and the akin to landscaping is perfect. Throughout the South, folks use fire to literally landscape around their homes and structures, and certainly they do on other continents. Um, Prescribed fire has tremendous utility, and I think us continuing to understand how that's used in a safe manner to meet the objectives is our task, but certainly.
All right, we had a question come in about the recording of this webinar, and yes, this webinar was recorded. You can check it out on the Southern Fire Exchange YouTube channel in a couple of weeks. We have all of our webinars, over 60 of them on there. So if you get a YouTube and you search Southern Fire Exchange, you can pull it up. All right, let's see what else we have in here. Jane asks, has there been much in the way of stand replacing mixed severity prescribed fire in the Western US? Jane says in Canada, they're doing some higher intensity and landscape scale burning, but there's been a real paucity of research on these larger mixed severity fires.
Yep, great question. That's always I mentioned the margin, and certainly the cooler margin is what many people have talked about with prescribed fire, but certainly there's increased interest across the globe in using fire in a high severity manner. Um, we're Many of the folks who are co-authors on this and our collaborators across the country and the world have been working on a few of these high severity prescribed fires. One of our prescribed fire science consortium events was a part of the fire and smoke model evaluation experiment, or FASME, that was held in central Utah. And we're, depending on how the remainder of this year goes, we're planning another one of those events there. And I think that, as you point out, that offers up so many other different possibilities. Those are stand replacing, the intent being high severity fire to regenerate aspen. And I think there are a lot of other examples. There are some in Florida with sandpine scrub, and others around the globe. And I think that's a really exciting area. It's always been an area from a researcher standpoint that's been difficult because you tend to have very few of those, and we tend to shy away from low numbers of replicates. But I think that those are, to be able to inform, again, using prescribed fire science to inform our understanding of how wildfires work, that offers a real possibility to do that. So it's a great question and really interesting.
There's a question that came in from June, and June asked, in general, do you think we need to conduct more prescribed fires? And is there any particular areas that need more prescribed fire, and what are the major barriers? All right, there's a can of worms for you, Morgan. Go ahead.
Yeah. Yes. It's really interesting. We're at an interesting time. You know, the push nationally in the United States has been to certainly maintain the tool of prescribed fire, and in areas where possible to increase it. And we know a lot of spots in the Western United States are primed. There's increasing public acceptability for it, in particular California. And we're hoping those individual states are hoping and planning on increasing prescribed fire. And I think that's clearly a frontier. Ironically, those same areas 50 or 60 years ago were national leaders in the topic. That's certainly the case with California and Montana, where prescribed fire was, those were, global examples of success stories. And I think returning fire to those areas is important. The impediments for those, that's another interesting, research side. Impediments tend to vary. There are a few families of impediments that are common. Narrow burn windows from an operational side tends to always be answered regardless of the region where it's queried. But there often are regional nuances. Places with lots of wildfires have a different affinity for prescribed fires than areas where wildfires are infrequent. And local ecosystems, almost at a biome level, are certainly more receptive to prescribed fire, easier for prescribed fire to be a common to be commonplace in management and in everyday work. And I think, those differ. It's a different answer for, a different county in Northern California than it is for another county. And I think, that gets a lot of interesting variation in, potential social science research.
There's an interesting question that came in, someone submitted through the chat. Julian asks, what success metrics would you recommend for prescribed fire managers? Time since last burn, average fire return interval, season. I think could you talk about ways of measuring prescribed fire success?
That's a great question. That's one I think we could spend an hour on.
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly interesting. Our typical metrics have been area or acres in the United States, area burned. And I think, that in a lot of ways as a fire ecologist, that's pretty frustrating. And as many of you have observed and participated in so many prescribed fires, you understand all the different perversions of a model where that's the primary metric of success. As we increasingly focus on concepts of resilience in ecosystems and their ability, that the picture that stays on your screen right now is an area that's had annual to biennial prescribed fires for a century or more. And, the trees are centuries old, and they're able to withstand drought, able to withstand other aberrations that many other forests in the region can't withstand. And I think getting to a more nuanced view of what success looks like and what the real ecological, economic outcomes of prescribed fire, that's a real challenge. That's a big topic and interesting one.
There's a question that came in in the Q&A. It's got quite a few upvotes at this point from Tom. And Tom says, how do you weigh the consequences of burning outside of your ideal window? And provides an example of saying dormant or growing season fires, nesting season, in comparison to or versus not being able to burn that unit on a given interval due to small burn windows and limited resources.
Well, Tom and upvoters, that's one that will surely incite a brawl. I think people are all over the spectrum on this issue. In Florida, it's a real, it's a hornet's nest of an issue. My position has always been that, fire at a higher frequency in these high frequency landscapes is clearly more important than limiting ourselves. That map of prescribed burn windows across the Southeast is some work we've done over looking at 30 years across the Southeast. And when land managers and their organizations restrict themselves to narrower and narrower windows, whether it's in Central Florida or in Northwestern California, what tends to happen is fires don't occur. Waiting for the perfect impedes the something better than that, or better than nothing is something. And in most of these landscapes, fire applied at high frequency or higher frequency certainly trumps the looking for specific conditions. And I think, it also opens up a lot. Fire effects research has been struggling to catch up with that topic for a long time. I think there's a lot of anecdote of, out of season burning or, other nuance that is way beyond, what we can talk about today. But I think fire effects research is trying to catch up with that topic, just to look at those factors where frequency, season, et cetera. But in general, restricting yourself to narrow periods of, narrower and narrower burn windows will definitely result in less fire and really more challenging fire management into the future.
All right, here's a question that came in from Dixie, and Dixie is asking about you mentioned the need for decision support tools.
Yeah.
Could you talk about some examples of decision support tools for prescribed fire that you're aware of, or maybe some that you see coming down the line?
Yeah, well, I think I hope that those who are interested in that topic, tune in to Rod Lynn, Kevin, and Scott Goodrick's webinar that's upcoming. They're going to be talking about it from a fire behavior decision support standpoint. In general, I taught decision support tools for a long time, both to managers and to undergraduate students. And in a lot of ways, if the comparison has been made to pilots that are flying, commercial jets, they clearly have to go through an apprentice period and a flight simulator as part of that. And for prescribed fire, from a fire behavior standpoint, we lack those same simulators, or at least our simulators are overly simplistic, and there's not a manager who would say that the current fire behavior prediction models do a great job. No one would say excellent or great. They're not going to get an A. And I think the ability, and that's just for wildfires. And if you put that for prescribed fires, we know that there are real shortcomings. So I think from a fire behavior standpoint, having better predictive as well as retrospective tools to be able to understand why something happened so that we can prevent it in the future, or at least mitigate in the future. But from from my own area of fire effects, tree mortality models that better predict the probability that a tree may die following fire, and what those injury characteristics are that make it likely to perish. And I think developing those in all the areas, fire weather has some clear openings. I think those are areas that managers are begging for. And I think it's a little bit embarrassing from the science side that we haven't provided better tools for them to this point.
Here's a question that came in from Dr. R. It says, you mentioned differences in reception of a prescribed fire science presentation from wildfire scientists and managers who were present. So basically, it's Dr. R says, at the end, are the end users of prescribed fire science and wildfire science, are they always the same people, or might they vary regionally? This is kind of something that our fire science exchange has been thinking about for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the two, and maybe I've, if Kevin or others might type in too, a few of us have given some presentation like this in a few cases. In the one that I was thinking of, where the audience response was, if they'd had clickers or if you were doing their polls, it would have been really interesting. But I could tell already, you could see the nods and the smiles from the managers. If I didn't know who they were before the talk, I knew who they were after, because they were so excited that this was a talk that got to their needs and spelled it out in a clear way. And I think the wildfire science community, I think we're all, in a lot of ways, we're all the same. We're all trying to, fire science has had a real applied bent for basically since its inception. And I think we're all trying to improve the situation and enable managers, give them the tools they need, and help them understand the outcomes that make them scratch their heads. And I think, certainly there's a little bit of a regional bent, and that is that kind of that east versus west. But I also think that for those who spend a lot of time in prescribed fire, and the seeing fire, working with fire, using it as a tool, it causes a really long list of questions. And in some ways, the undergraduate freshman assumes that whatever field they're in, the textbook is an encyclopedia and everything is known. And I think for prescribed fire, that's not the case at all. And I think it's kind of a ham-fisted approach sometimes when we use a lot of the tools that were developed for, to predict wildfire spread or to understand tree mortality, when managers know that there should be other buttons in those tools, or that we're not asking the right question or bringing in the right aspect. And I think that gets at some of the complexity. We're a broad community, and we've had a lot of folks who see it as it's us versus them. And I think, more fairly, it is, let's give prescribed fire science a seat at the table. If the calls nationally and globally are maintain or increase prescribed fire, then we ought to have a better science science footing to understand moving forward, and to also understand some of the inconsistencies that every one of us observes, whether it's a 1 acre prescribed fire or it's a couple thousand acre stand replacing fire.
All right. Well, Morgan, I think we're going to wrap up on that one. Morgan, appreciate your presentation. Thanks everybody who stayed with us and participated and submitted questions to the webinar today. Hopefully at this point you should be able to see Morgan's email address on the screen. So if you had a question submitted that we didn't get to, or you'd like to follow up with him, or if you are interested in learning more about the Prescribed Fire Science Consortium, feel free to reach out. So Morgan, thank you so much for joining us today. Really enjoyed your presentation, and thanks everybody for those questions.
Thanks, David.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody, and stay well.